presentation is going to be about production chain and their future in Asia in particular and globally, perhaps more generally. The presentation will be done by Professor Chen, Arndt, the Director of Global Trade Analysis Project hosted in the Purdue University. Professor Arndt has been is a program professor and research has been wide range, including on growth, market integration, and so on and so forth. So Professor Arndt's presentation will be discussed by Professor Maggie Chen from the George Washington University. She's a professor of economics and international affairs in the university, focusing mostly on research about foreign direct investment, international trade, and regional trade agreements. Both of them are very distinguished academics. So without any further ado, Professor Chan, 30 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me share. Let me just, if you stop sharing the current version, then I'll be able to share over into the my files. There we go. Here we go. And share. And then, so this should be going just fine, right, Arief? Very good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about production chains and their future in a new international landscape, and we'll focus on the new international landscape in order to get into the production chains. So this is joint work with Erwin Kourung and Tiago Simonato, who are also kindly on the call. I'm Chen, as mentioned. I'm the director of the Global Trade Analysis Project, and I really thank the ADBI for the opportunity to work on this paper and to present here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present briefly an overview of the Global Trade Analysis Project so people can understand where we're coming from and how we're using stuff. And then I think a big issue is going on obviously right now is what's going on in the United States and talk about what their ambitions and motivations are. We at GTAP, and I'll talk about it a little bit, produce a global data set. So we have a new data set and we'll present a couple of key stylized facts using the 2023 data that just came out about a month ago. Briefly talk about our modeling approach, some simulations, some results, and discussion and summary. So Global Trade Analysis Project was founded in 1992. It supports a global network of researchers and decision makers for the conduct of quantitative analysis of global issues. Started off with trade, and it's moved into lots of different global issues, with the goal of then improving the quality of that analysis in support of decision making. A really important part of the project is the philosophy, which is collaboration in data and community building. Collaboration where it helps, and then an open marketplace for ideas. So we may disagree on the best analytical framework, but hopefully we can agree on what the data are. Actually. And GTAP has become a language for discussing all sorts of issues, and that's helped to increase its influence. It's supported by a consortium and advisory board to about 30 institutions worldwide that provide a small financial commitment and also their advice, including Multiplicity in Asia. So just in a little more detail, what does JTAP do? So one is lower barriers to high quality analysis, and this is through data, and I'll get into that. Models, we supply models that people can use to work off of the data set for global analysis, but you can also use your own model, of course. Training. The GTAP network is pretty large. There's, as I mentioned, right now there's about 30 consortium members and also right around 500 purchasers of the database or users of the database. And then at the GTAP hub where I am, we're quite large concentration of economy-wide modelers. We also have increasing capabilities in gridded economic modeling. GTAP finally serves as a platform. Our annual conference will be in Kyoto in June, and so we invite submissions to that. We do virtual events, and we have a journal of global economic analysis, which is now amazingly in the top 1 to 2% of journals in REPIC. So what is the database? We are an assembler of coherent data. The database has value flows of economic activity, so 65 sectors for each of 145 countries in 18 regions. We do it in time series, so we have roughly every 3 or 4 years between 2004 and 2023. There's a lot of extensions, and when we say satellites, we don't mean the things that are circling the Earth. We mean satellites that are circling the data set, so emissions, critical minerals, nutrition accounts. Like I mentioned, we've just come out with V12, which has 2 base years, 2019 and 2023. This was released to consortium members on October 10th, which is a month ago, a little bit more, and we'll plan for public release in early 26. If all goes well, we'll release on January 12th to the public. So where did the data come from? One of the most important part are the input-output or social counting matrices, which come from contributors typically inside countries, and a whole bunch of people of organizations that keep tabs of specific sets of data that we process and make coherent. Here are some examples of the satellite accounts: energy, agroecological zones, multi-region input-output, product projections, non-tariff measures, biofuels, circular economy. Doing a lot of work in critical minerals, which has of great interest these days, and we've just produced work on GTAP food balance sheets, including food loss and waste. Basically, in terms of summary, GTAP and the new trade landscape, here we are. We have a base year 2023 global data set. Took quite a lot of work this is the first time we've released two base years and moved quickly to get 2023 out. So we expect it to go to the sort of 500 clients, within a couple months. And this is highly likely to be a workhorse analytical tool for this new landscape. So what we thought we would do for this presentation is to just take a standard modeling approach, focus on the basics of the new landscape. We'll be getting into more detail on Asia as we go forward, and we do expect sort of more sophisticated analytics to come from many quarters, including the center, but from other places as well. But we wanted to have a baseline to start with, so that's our objective for today, and that's what I'll be running through right now. So, what are the apparent ambitions and motivations of the United States? And on the ambition side, there's a paper by Stephen Moran, who's now the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration, and this was published in November of 2024, so just before the administration formed. And the executive summary says we're on the cusp of generational change in the international trade and financial systems. And all the evidence is that there's just a very high level of ambition in terms of reorienting, not forming, reorienting the global international system. So that's I think, just an important point. Why? Persistent macroeconomic imbalances is one thing often pointed to. The mathematics is clear. If one country is exporting more than it imports, then another country would be importing more than it exports. Decline of U.S. manufacturing is often referred to. They're very explicit about the burden of the U.S.-led security architecture. And there is a perception that substantial leverage, the U.S. has left substantial leverage unused in global economic and global negotiations. And then there's a very specific revenue generation motivation. So the tools for trying to address these issues, and this is coming out of the November paper. Tariffs viewed as relatively easy and should go first. Inside the paper, there's a specific optimal tariff argument. So a use of market power, the fact that the U.S. is a large country and can influence global prices, that's explicitly inside the paper. There's lots of reference to leverage, tariffs themselves once in place, the security arrangements, and then what they call financial extraterritoriality, which just means that most trade occurs in dollars, and so actually the U.S. banking system is quite powerful over trade. The second mode is U.S. currency depreciation, which is viewed as relatively hard and should go second, and we won't be touching it here. So this is a graph on the optimal tariff, and basically this comes from, we haven't had a chance to run it on the new data. This comes from the version 11, the previous or the data set that's available to the public right now, and basically it shows that. As you augment tariffs from a relatively low level, you can shift terms of trade. So you can reduce the price of the products that you import and increase the price of the products that you export. And this confers to you a gain that is, the flip side of a loss elsewhere. The tariffs also bring about some deadweight loss, some economic inefficiency, and as the rates go up, the inefficiencies mount, and eventually the inefficiencies overcome the terms of trade gains. The GTAP, this is an older version, gives a somewhat higher optimal tariff than what Moran calculates. Moran calculates around a 20% optimal tariff. If you're going to be having an optimal tariff and it's going to work, it's quite important that there's no retaliation. Otherwise the market power is blunted. So preventing retaliation will be of great importance. This is a point in the paper. So that's, I think, really important. And it's also important, I think, to just recognize that thus far, there's been a lot of success on preventing retaliation. We're converging towards 15 to 20% incremental tariffs, except with China, which puts tariffs on average, with some exemptions and exceptions, at pretty near the 20% optimal tariff rate that Moran it would apparently be shooting for. There is a trade war with China, or there was, and so China has retaliated, but more or less the only one. Not much other than that. There is a strong emphasis from the U.S. administration on bilateral trade negotiations. This is, I think, explicitly to prevent countries from acting as blocs, like the BRICS. And then there's a more explicit trade and security have always been linked, and this is always part of the discussion, but there's more explicit link of trade and security than at any time really in my lifetime. I think in anybody's lifetime on this particular call. Tariff revenue is significant. More than $30 billion in net customs revenue in August, another 30 billion in September versus about 7 billion per month in 2024. So if the terms of trade gains are realized, this would be an inexpensive source of revenue. And the tariffs may become entrenched in the US politically because the revenue is reasonably significant. It's substantially more than 1% of GDP. And if firms start to invest behind the protection, then you will have a constituency for the tariffs coming about. So if we return to the motivations, and I think this is a useful point, that the first four are really, you could argue, differences of degree. That previous administrations have worried about macroeconomic imbalances, worried about the manufacturing sector, spoken of the burden of the US-led security architecture. And of course, all countries, internally worry about what kind of leverage they have, how they can use it, what's appropriate. The fifth one, revenue generation using an optimal tariff argument, is really a difference of kind. The much of the international institutional architecture is really designed to explicitly prevent putting in place policies that simply shift the playing field where so that one country loses and another country gains in a zero or even negative sum way. Which is largely what you get with these optimal tariff arguments. So it's kind of a removal of a pillar of the multilateral trading system, which the U.S. was supporting. So it's a difference of kind versus previous administrations. And it really puts the rules, norms, and institutions associated with the trading system, the global trading system, in flux. So this is where we are. So what are some of the facts As we look at the situation today, I'm just going to go into a couple. So first, I think we'll look at the world through the lens of interconnected regional economies. Integrated with respect to world trade. So members of the interconnected regional economies, and this has just been mentioned, how much East Asian countries and South trade with each other. They trade more within the ICRE than with non-ICRE countries, and there are really three interconnected regional economies that dominate the world: North America, Europe, and East and Southeast Asia. So if we look at the trade shares that we're seeing here, and this is the total trade, and we're also looking at GDP. And so I think the first thing to point out is, if we just look over here, and I think you could see it, U.S. is a really large economy relative to the rest of the world. It's 26% of GDP, and that's actually been rising recently. But they're actually not that large of a trader. So in terms of exports, only 9% of total global exports from the United States, and 14% of imports, have a pretty large, quite large current account deficit. This is goods and services, I believe. When you compare with others, there's smaller economies, such as Europe as a bloc, 37% of exports and roughly almost 37% of imports. The East and Southeast Asia region is not that large in GDP, about 10%, but fully 15% of trade, substantial of exports, and about where is it? 14 point, so about 14.5 on either side, exports and imports. U.S. is large. Some of this has to do, as these is just sort of trading with each other. Europe, East and Southeast Asia trading with each other, and NAFTA trading with each other. But even if we take that out and just focus on the numbers without the intra-regional trade, which takes away about a little bit less than half of total trade, nevertheless, the U.S. Is, not that large of an exporter. It's still a larger. It becomes relatively more important, but it's still not as big as Europe and not as big as the combination of China and East and Southeast Asia. So that's I think an important element to bear in mind. All right, tariffs faced and imposed. This is on the 2023 data set. These are just tariffs as we see them. The red is imposed and the blue is faced. This is Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, Korea, and then these are the regional offices of the Asian Development Bank: East Asia, Pacific, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Central and West Asia. And then these are fairly obvious: Canada, U.S., Mexico, rest of South America, Europe, and the rest of the world. So those are the tariffs faced, and the important thing is just these numbers are not very big. If you look at Europe, all below 1, U.S. just in between 1 and 2, Canada, these are not very large numbers. When we go and we add the non-tariff measures, and these are our estimates from 2019, you get also somewhat larger numbers, and a big number faced in the Pacific by their exports of fish and so forth. But even if you combine these two, these numbers are much less than the level of tariff that's being put in place by the current U.S. administration. 15, 20, 25% is just a really large number, I think is the point. So those are big. How we're going to analyze this is with a global economy-wide model. So this is a schemata of the modeling approach. And basically, the global economy is a closed system. Everything that's spent somewhere is earned somewhere else. We divide up between saving. We have savings, investment, government, private households, producers, the rest of the world, and the full flow, including an input-output table. In terms of the way we go about this modeling approach, we're taking what's relatively standard. So we doing perfect competition, comparative static, full employment, important assumption, savings-driven investment, and we use the Armington trade structure. The aim is just to illustrate some of the basic forces at play and provide a baseline for future analysis. Um, Limitations, there are plenty. So with this particular comparative static approach, we don't draw a transition pathway. We just jump from one equilibrium to another. The CES functional forms on the Armington have some structure. We abstract more or less completely from the microstructure of production, which is a lot of focus of the current modern trade literature, the extensive margin, fixed cost export, and so forth. Model is fully deterministic. There's no risk. Um, there's things that also that are limitations that are not just limitations for GTAP style modeling. It's just difficult to capture non-tariff measures, and nobody does that particularly well. And then most of the models in trade are real side models, so macro financial features are captured in a really stylized way or not at all. Nevertheless, a lot of the really important things that are going on are real economy side forces are captured well, and in particular, relatives are captured well. It sounds bad if you're getting a 15% tariff by the United States, but it's if everybody else is getting 20, that makes a big difference. So this approach will capture that. We're doing 5 scenarios. We've added one, Maggie. So the the U.S. imposes tariffs with no retaliation anywhere. So this is just the Trump tariffs going in. Nobody does anything. Second is the first, but China retaliates roughly at the rates imposed by the U.S. They're actually getting uh, so that's an assumed retaliation. Then we assume that all countries retaliate against the U.S. at roughly the bilateral rates imposed by the U.S. So this is kind of tariff escalation. And then we do instead, so two, so we're building on scenario 2 instead of 3 plus. So we do 2 plus liberalization across all countries, excluding the United States and China. So the rest of the world, East and Southeast Asia, liberalizes with everybody else, which is pretty much in line with the previous discussion about the open liberalism that we had in the talk that was just given. And then the fifth one is again 2, but liberalization across all countries, just except the United States. So the rest of the world also liberalizes with China. So selected global results are, and I'll focus on the ones in red. So the first one, this basically as we impose more tariffs, we get more and more cost on global GDP. So the U.S. imposes a small cost on global GDP. When China retaliates, it's slightly bigger, and when the world retaliates, it's even more. What's interesting is if there's not this retaliation and there's this decoupling, then there's a shift. We move to positive GDP effects, and this gives you a notion of the collective weight of the quote rest of the world, not China, not U.S., is quite large. The effect of the U.S. tariffs on total global trade, global exports equal global imports. So is pretty large, larger than I thought actually, almost 4.4%. Doesn't change very much as the tariffs escalate, but global trade, if with the what we call decouple from China and the U.S. or decouple from the world, but or decouple only from the U.S. Those are the more liberal scenarios. Is positive, and global welfare tracks exactly the GDP and is falling globally when U.S. Tariffs are imposed. Goes up again when China retaliates. Falls again when the world retaliates, but is shifted to positive if there's a liberalization push. Key to the whole thing, I think understanding a lot of what's going on is the U.S. tariffs on this model, and this is a kind of a longer term run. So this would mean that the situation is staying in place for a few years, and people think that it's a relatively permanent situation. In that case, you get to a terms of trade effect that's quite positive for the U.S. About 5.7% increase in U.S. improvement in U.S. terms of trade. When China retaliates, that only gets slightly knocked back. When the world retaliates, it almost goes away, but not entirely, which is interesting. In the U.S. and the rest of the world decouples from the U.S. and China, they just liberalize amongst themselves. This shifts, and then in the decoupling from U.S., you get the U.S. terms of trade getting worse again. So that's consistent with what Moran was talking about. GDP, the U.S. actually takes quite a big GDP shock, and this seems to be because there's a fair amount of dispersion in the tariffs that the U.S. is applying, and as a consequence, there's the differences for similar commodities across countries that are driving quite a bit of diversion, and so the U.S. GDP effect is pretty pronounced, but not because of the full employment assumption, not very large overall. On terms of regional welfare, you get what basically was expected. The U.S., because of the terms of trade gain, if nobody retaliates, gets a welfare gain. About 18 billion, it's not very large. But even if China retaliates, it's still a gain. So you get substantial tariff revenue and a very small welfare gain under this. So there's a logic to it. And then if the world retaliates, that disappears. And then some of these actually decoupling scenarios are actually rather good for the U.S. And that just has to do with their trade patterns, which we track. So in sum, to wrap up, seeking generational change in the international trade and financial system, the U.S. is a very large economy, even larger really in security, dominant in finance, but not that large in trade. So this is a difference. I think it's important that they were very careful to avoid retaliation. Thus far, it's been successful. And this is key to locking in some of the terms of trade gains. Insistence on bilateral negotiations has been an important tactical element. And then there's been like I said, this very strong link between security and trade. And the revenue take is substantial. It's useful to note that the world trading systems held up quite well outside of trade with the U.S. So there hasn't been, like there was in the 1930s, sort of a series of tariffs that are put on everybody, putting tariffs on everybody else for all sorts of products. Nevertheless, there's a lot to work on in terms of norms, rules, and institutions. These are in flux. So this is where we are right now. Where we're headed, some things more clear. I really don't see a return to a U.S.-led multilateral trading system. None of us do. The longer the U.S. tariffs remain, the more difficult they will be to remove. That almost goes without saying. And we have a pretty strong trade rivalry between the U.S. and China that seems very likely to persist. A lot less clear is stability of the current situation. It doesn't feel as stable as it certainly could be. And then the evolution and behavior of the international institutional architecture. And will you get, as I think some of the speakers earlier have alluded to, potential of a revival of a commitment to a rules-based international trading system. You never miss your water until the well runs dry, and this has helped. And it's also perfectly possible that these commitments fray in a less a more uncertain world. So that's where things are going. So just to wrap up, so, and I think this is in line again with some of the almost all the previous speakers. What if you're not the USA or China? What do you do now? And I think that you need to simultaneously care for three relationships. If you're in Asia, then you can't ignore China. You also, almost most countries, you really can't ignore the United States either. And you do have these two rivals that neither of whom you would like to get on the wrong side of. So that's just something that you need to care for. But you shouldn't be ignoring the rest of the world and this open regionalism or moving to take positive steps to deepen integration amongst the rest of the world. ASEAN with other parts of the world, as was being mentioned, developing world, Africa, Latin America, Europe, also available, has the results indicate that this has a strong potential to improve growth and development prospects, as well as reinforce a rules-based system. So with that, Arif, I think I'm dead at 30 minutes, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Arndt, and also for keeping the time. Let me now move to Professor Chen for a discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. I will share my screen now. So hold on 1 second. I hope you can see the screen.
You can see
Thanks
it
very
now.
much for having me again. I really enjoy reading the paper. In the last several months, I've been asked a lot of times whether I have been using GTAP, and because the demand for GTAP has grown, I think, in the last several months. So this is perfect timing for me to really dive into this research project and not only the overview of the trade policy landscape, but also the quantitative evidence on different scenarios. So just a quick recap. The paper was looking at, the post-2025 trade landscape amid, in the middle of all the uncertainties of protectionism and strategic decoupling and or even liberalization. And Chen and the co-authors have been using the global CGE model combined with the latest 2023 GTAP dataset to really quantify how different scenarios of tariffs and liberalization would reshape trade, GDP, and welfare for different regions, not just the US and China, but also different other regions. When I received the paper, there were 4 scenarios, but I'm really glad that the author added the fifth scenario, which totally is very reasonable, is in the direction of one of my comments. So you pretty much forecasted my comment. So 4 scenarios in the version I received. The first one is the baseline US raise tariffs unilaterally without retaliation. The second scenario is retaliation, particularly, by China. And then the third scenario is global tariff escalation with the rest of the world participating in retaliation as well. And then we have the open, sort of regionalism scenarios when the rest of the world liberalizes trade, either excluding both the US and China, or in the fifth scenario that was just presented, excluding only the United States. So, what were the main findings? The paper finds that trade in the baseline protectionism scenario, the unilateral scenario, would decline by about 4 to 5%, right? In that scenario, in that same scenario, US would experience, modest short-run welfare gains. And in particular, the main mechanism here is the terms of trade improvements. That welfare gain for the United States can disappear and turn negative once there is, retaliation, especially from the rest of the world. or when the alternative liberalization initiatives emerge. Other regions, however, can actually recoup the losses when they choose to have deeper liberalization. Now, the paper has a lot to offer. As I mentioned, it gives us very timely evidence on the gains and the losses from the post-2025 trade scenarios. It does not just talk about what's going to happen to the US and China trade and welfare and GDP, but very importantly, the spillover effects to the rest of the world. What I really appreciate about the paper is that it really tries to look into the role of terms of trade in driving the welfare gains, right? Because the welfare gains can come from terms of trade improvements, it can also come from productivity improvements, tariff revenue, and so on. So I think this particular insight is very valuable. And then CGE model, in my views, it's very adaptable, very versatile tool. It really allows policymakers and practitioners to, look into different scenarios and gain a very helpful, comprehensive picture of how different countries would be affected. So, and I think the beauty of that tool is really well reflected in this paper. Now, I'm just gonna offer some, comments and suggestions. I know some of the ideas are probably already mentioned by Chen. One idea that I had in mind is decomposition of welfare. The paper already does a lot of this by showing, the welfare dynamics as well as the subcomponents, like the terms of trade, GDP, and so on. But I wonder if the authors can go a step further to decompose, okay, what's the percentage of the welfare gains or losses would come from terms of trade? What's the percentage coming from allocative efficiency or tariff revenue, right? As Chen mentioned, the tariff revenue was one major motivation as well for the US. So I think it would be really interesting to know how much of the welfare gains for the United States, for example, reflect efficiency improvements. Or, as we probably saw, most of that come from the terms of trade shifts. A second comment is that with CGE, and in fact, it was all counterfactual analysis, it would be, I think, first of all, I would love to know a little bit more details about the trade elasticities being used. By construction, the results will depend on the magnitude of trade elasticities. And if we can do some robustness checks with different levels of trade elasticities and whether we have actually sectoral trade elasticities in the analysis, that wasn't clear to me. So a robustness check would be really helpful. And then also more details on the tariff shocks, especially for the different scenarios, right? We are still, I think things are quickly changing and evolving as we just saw recently, right? Tariffs were were brought down a little bit. So I wonder if, what tariff levels should we be using in the scenarios? I don't really have an answer. I think it's really hard to say there is, the only one. I think there's just different levels of tariff scenarios we can think about. And then another possibility that I think what's happening empirically is that a lot of trade, right, regionally from between the US and China, especially from China to the US, is rerouted through third countries, right? Some of that is through FDI, some of them is just rerouting. And I wonder how the model can or cannot take that into account, right? And we know, for example, anecdotally, Vietnam, these Southeastern Asian countries have received some of these rerouting in some sectors. So how will that change our assessments of, trade effects and so on? And then speaking of additional scenario, I think this is very much relevant to the fifth scenario Chen has done in the last couple of days. And I think one scenario I really wanted to see is how a deepened Asian bloc would look like, right? I'm thinking about RCEP, I'm thinking about CPTPP, right? Instead of looking at the liberalization by the rest of the world, how about just Asia, the Asian bloc or the Asian Pacific bloc? And what would that look like compared to the existing counterfactuals? Um, Now, then after these comments, I have some more, um, I guess, more like for future work. Okay, I don't know how plausible or how feasible it is to do that in the context of this paper, um, because we are using a static, version of the model, CGE model. But by doing that, we are not really capturing, for example, investment relocation, which I think is a major drive right now about what's happening in the reallocation of our GVC, right? Um, and as you can see here from this chart, right, the greenfield FDI in manufacturing by developed countries, right? In ASEAN, in the last couple of years have been rising, where FDI, greenfield FDI in China, declined. So some of that is FDI diversion, right? Not just trade diversion, but FDI diversion. And I think this can change, especially our GDP numbers a lot, not just trade numbers, but the GDP numbers. If you look at the GDP predictions here, right, you can see most of the magnitudes are fairly moderate, right? Except for example, Mexico. I mean, Mexico probably, apart from the US, Mexico sees the biggest changes in GDP. And I think FDI reallocation might actually reinforce the GDP gains for ASEAN countries and Mexico even more. Um, and then finally, I think this is my last sort of ambitious future idea is you mentioned already non-tariff measures are very difficult to account for, and I really agree with that. But in retaliation these days, as we already saw, is not limited to tariffs, right? Export controls have turned out to be quite powerful tools by the countries. So perhaps we don't really need to look into all non-tariff measures, but a scenario that would be quite interesting is to look into export controls. And to see how that, right, especially in some industries where there are bottlenecks, would really amplify the welfare losses when there are retaliations happening. So I'll stop here and happy to talk more after.
Thank you, Professor Chen, for the spot-on comments. Before I give time back to Professor Arndt, let me just add one question that come up in the Q&A box, which is related to some of the points that Professor Chen raised earlier. The question basically asking is about the possibility of including another interesting scenario whereby the U.S. challenges, the U.S. changes its stance and liberalizes together with the rest of the world, can lead a large reduction in global tariff. What would happen in that particular scenario is what the question is asking basically. So let me have Professor Arndt responding to all the comments from Professor Chen, and as well as touch upon about the possibility of that question from the floor. Please, Professor Arndt.
Yeah, thank you very much, Maggie, for your comments. And largely, I just agree with more or less everything. We can do a decomposition of welfare. We'll do that. We just yeah, getting a whole global database for 2023 together, and then getting all the shocks together, and getting and then attending going down to Brazil. It was busy getting all this stuff going. Robustness with respect to trade elasticities, yes. I think the tariff shocks, but we've done a lot of work on that and actually slowed things down because, we just didn't know which tariff to put there, right? And so, it's just kind of, well, okay, we'll just kind of wait. I think, we can do a really good job on rerouting of trade, especially where, so actually there's an interesting paper by McKinsey that looks at similarity of products. And, I like a couple of examples that they give. The first is it turns out that the US is the major supplier of a buyer of Christmas stuff, lights for your trees and things like that. So we buy most of what's exported, the US does, and it almost all comes from China. So there's kind of very little scope to sort of send around. Whereas, Vietnam, China may send this shirt to the United States. And Vietnam might send the shirt that Arief's wearing to Europe or to somewhere else, some other destination. And when we put in when the U.S. puts on a tariff, especially high on China, there's a real incentive just to switch. And there's quite a few products that are able to handle that, and the model handles that quite well. There's just plain cheating, right? Where you just bring in and stick a different label on there and send it out. And that's hard. Obviously, cheating is by definition hard to track. Or where all you're doing is changing the label. You're not doing anything to the product and exporting from, say, Vietnam. But that isn't that large of what we've observed. We have observed in the data, China trading quite effectively. Their statistics are out, right? So their trade with the United States is down quite a bit, but trade with the world, trade overall, exports overall are up, which I think is remarkable. And it does show U.S. as not that large of a trader, right? So they're able to trade around. I like the additional scenario deepening of the Asia bloc, and you're absolutely right that the FDI reallocation is absolutely critical and would drive a lot more GDP kind of effect. And the key there is, what's it going to be, right? And the CG model gives you a hint, right? Some of the movements, but then how strong is it? If we knew what it was, we could do a great job of modeling it. The key is, what is it? How much are you going to get? And then, I think we've gone from a world where, tariffs were the big threat to a world where really export controls are a really large threat, right? If you have power in certain areas, because that just is, anything that's critical across a variety of. I mean, the classic is fuel, right? If you don't have fuel, then it's just pure GDP compression. But it's the same apparently for certain very small volumes of critical minerals for certain manufacturing processes are absolutely critical, as well as semiconductors. And in fact, we're just now writing a proposal to look at the semiconductor issue. We do have the working really hard on a critical minerals database that we can append to the regular GTAP data, so we can look at. We'd like by the middle of the year to have a pretty good idea of what the flows of critical minerals were in 2023 and have kind of a pathway for projecting what's been going on based on investments in mining and other processing, looking into the future, not long after the middle of 2023. So that those are things that we're working on. Thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you, Professor Arndt. We still have about 5 minutes to go, so let me invite questions, both from the panels here or from the audience. Please type your question in the Q&A box.
and I didn't address Jose's, which is
Yes, please.
I think that's a good idea. And looking forward to, suppose that the U.S. wants to change policy. Um, how difficult is that, right? What do you have to do to get back out? And suppose that you're, you know, 3.5 years further down the road, and you're trying to extricate yourself from, or trying to, shape back to a different policy. How hard is it? I think, and what kind of gains do you get? These transition issues are something that we could look at, and then just vulnerability issues is which we've already looked at, which has to do with, right now, you haven't had much retaliation against the U.S. in terms of tariff rates, but that doesn't mean that you won't get any in 2 or 3 years time. So both of those things are things to worry about. So thanks for that.
Right. Thank you, Professor Arndt. Any hands up or additional question? Okay, if not, then maybe before we wrap up, I just like to ask one question that I didn't really see in your presentation, Channing. How would the production chain in the region would look like because of this? I hope you can have some insight from it in your based on your analysis.
Yeah, we want to look at a couple of things, and one thing is, one of the objectives is to drive up employment in manufacturers in the U.S., right? And we want to look in detail. We haven't had a chance to look into the detailed sets of results. Look at that, and then what's happening elsewhere, right? So I think that I think, Arief, it's really interesting that you've had essentially all of the speakers talking about this open regionalism context, and ending on that point, and the opportunities that are there to advance your economic objectives. I think that's a good point, and it would apply to the value chains. But we know that we owe you that analysis, and we'll get that into the paper.
All right. Thank you very much. Please join me to thank Professor